Welcome, dear listeners, to Aura Tales Triumph. Before we step into tonight's world, I'd love to know, where is the sun setting for you right now? Are you in the historic streets of Virginia or Massachusetts, the vibrant energy of Lagos, or the mist-covered hills of Scotland? Perhaps you're watching from Texas, Toronto, or somewhere quiet under the stars. Let us know in the comments. And if you find yourself drawn to slow-burn romances, stories of tension, vengeance, and secrets whispered by candlelight, do subscribe and become part of our growing tale. Now, settle in. They thought it would be funny, a little joke to lighten the evening, put the quiet one on the block, see if anyone bites. What they did not expect was him. The chandeliers of Whitmore Hall burned like 100 cold suns the night they decided to make me a punchline. I had worn the emerald gown because my mother said it made me look presentable, not beautiful, not striking, just presentable, which in our family's vocabulary was the highest compliment a daughter like me could earn. I had pinned my hair the way they liked it, soft and unassuming, and I had stood at the edge of the ballroom all evening, doing what I had mastered over 23 years of living in this house, disappearing. But disappearing, it turns out, is a privilege they can revoke whenever it suits them. It was my Uncle Bertram who made the announcement, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that disguises itself as wit. He gestured toward the raised platform near the auctioneer's podium, the one they had been using all evening to sell off donated art and vintage wine for the charity fund, and he said, loud enough for the entire gilded room to hear, "And for our final lot of the evening, ladies and gentlemen, one slightly overlooked Owen daughter. Do I hear a starting bid? Perhaps a shilling. Surely she's worth at least a shilling." The laughter came fast. It always does in rooms like this, where cruelty wears cufflinks and mockery is passed around like champagne. I felt the heat of the spotlight before I even understood what was happening, a hand at my elbow guiding me upward onto the platform, and suddenly I was standing above the crowd, elevated, not in honor, but in humiliation, the laughter rising like floodwater around my ankles. I clasped my gloved hands together so no one would see them shake. I fixed my gaze on a point above the chandelier and reminded myself to breathe. And then silence. Not the polite, momentary silence of a room catching its breath, a sudden silence, absolute and commanding, the kind that happens when someone in the room shifts the entire gravity of the space simply by existing in it. He was standing near the far pillar, half in shadow, as though he had been watching the whole affair from a careful distance and had only now decided he had seen enough. Dark coat, unreadable expression, a jaw set like carved stone, and eyes that moved across the room with the unhurried authority of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. The Duke of Ravenwood. People whispered his name like a warning. He had been absent from society for 3 years, no galas, no salons, no appearances at the houses of people who spent their evenings doing exactly this, performing wealth and calling it culture. His sudden presence alone was enough to still the room, but it was what he did next that stopped my heart entirely. He reached into his coat. He produced a sealed note and handed it to the auctioneer without a word. The auctioneer unfolded it, and whatever was written there drained the color from the man's face before he looked up and announced, in a voice that cracked slightly at the edges, $1 million. Nobody laughed after that. The Duke finally looked up, not at the room, not at my uncle, not at the sea of stunned faces surrounding him, but directly, deliberately, unflinchingly, at me. and in that look was something I had never once received in my own family home, something more disorienting than the mockery, more dangerous than the spotlight. He looked at me as though I were the only thing in the room worth seeing. He did not ask permission. That was the first thing I noticed. Most men in rooms like this operated on a currency of permissions, the careful nod toward the patriarch, the deferential tilt of the chin, the unspoken negotiation that happened between powerful men before a woman was ever consulted about her own life. Richard J. Davis, the Duke of Ravenwood, observed none of these rituals. He simply crossed the ballroom floor with the measured certainty of a man who had already decided how the evening would end, and when he reached the base of the platform, he extended one hand upward, not grabbing, not commanding, simply offering, and looked at me as though the choice, remarkably, was mine. I took his hand. I do not know precisely what moved me to do it. Perhaps it was the silence still ringing in the room, or the residual heat of 100 laughing faces now frozen in bewilderment. Perhaps it was simply that his hand was the first thing offered to me all evening that did not carry a price. Whatever the reason, my gloved fingers settled into his, and he guided me down from the platform with a steadiness that made the whole absurd theater of the last 5 minutes feel, strangely, like it had already been forgotten. It had not been forgotten by my father. Silas Owen materialized from the crowd with the speed of a man accustomed to controlling the narrative of every room he entered. His face wore that particular expression I knew intimately, the one that looked like dignity to strangers, but was, to those of us who had grown up beneath it, something closer to barely contained fury wrapped in a dinner jacket. Ravenwood. His voice was cordial, his eyes were not. Generous of you. Naturally, this was all in good fun. There's no need to... The bid stands. Richard did not look at my father when he said it. He was still looking at me, with that same unhurried attention, as though Silas Owen were a piece of furniture he had politely noted and moved on from. And I believe the terms of a charity auction are binding, unless you'd like to explain to your guests why you're attempting to rescind a $1 million donation. The silence that followed was a beautiful thing. I had never heard my father silenced before, not once in 23 years. The sound of it, or rather the magnificent absence of sound, settled over me like something warm. Silas's jaw tightened. Around us, the assembled guests watched with the breathless attention of people who had come expecting an unremarkable evening and now witnessing something they would describe at every dinner party for the next decade. My uncle had gone very still near the fireplace. My brother, I noticed, had the grace to look at the floor. "Shall we?" Richard said, to me, only to me, and offered his arm. We walked out of Whitmore Hall through the grand front entrance, past the footman and the flickering entrance lamps and the line of carriages waiting in the cold night air. Nobody stopped us. Nobody spoke. The doors closed behind us with a soft, final sound, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time since I had stepped into that gown. The night was clear and cold and indifferently magnificent. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. He considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved, then responded without looking at me, his gaze moving out across the lamplit street ahead. "No," I agreed. "I wanted to." Inside the hall, distantly, I imagined my father's silence curdling into something uglier. Out here, it did not touch me. Not yet. He took me to a restaurant that had no sign above the door. That detail struck me as I stepped out of the carriage onto a quiet, lamp-lit street in the older quarter of the city, where the buildings pressed close together like conspirators sharing secrets. No menu displayed in the window, no maitre d' hovering at the entrance performing welcome, just a dark wooden door that opened before Richard reached it, as though the building itself had been expecting him, and warm amber light that spilled outward into the cold like something carefully guarded. Inside it was small and unhurried, and entirely unlike every dining room my family had ever considered worthy of their presence. Bare stone walls, candles burned low in iron holders. A single table near the far window had been laid for two, and I understood, without being told, that this had been arranged in advance. He had been certain, then, even before the bid. That thought unsettled me more than it should have. We were brought bread and wine without asking, and for a while neither of us spoke, which should have been uncomfortable and was, instead, bewilderingly not. I studied the candlelight. He studied something in the middle distance. The city moved quietly outside the window, indifferent and continuous. "The Aldemir Library," he said finally. I looked up. 3 years ago. His eyes met mine across the table with the same directness he had leveled at me on the platform, except here, stripped of the ballroom and the crowd and the performance of it all, it felt considerably more exposing. The east colonnade had begun to separate from the main structure. 3 engineers had assessed it. All 3 recommended demolition of the wing. I said nothing. I knew exactly which morning he meant. I had known it the moment he said the name, the Aldemir Library. The cold October light coming through the damaged roof, the smell of old stone and damp timber, and something else beneath it, something mineral and specific, that had told me what the engineers with their measuring instruments had somehow missed. "You were there," I said. It was not quite a question. "I was funding the restoration." A pause. "Or attempting to, until I was told the wing was unsalvageable." He turned his wineglass once, slowly by the stem. "And then a woman appeared on the site. No introduction, no credentials offered, walked the length of the colonnade, crouched at the 3rd pillar from the eastern end, and announced that the separation wasn't structural failure, it was water redirection. An original drainage channel had been blocked during a previous renovation. Clear it, she said, reinforce the affected section, and the building would stand for another 2 centuries. "It will," I said quietly. "I checked last spring." Something moved across his face then, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "I know. I was there for that too." The admission landed softly between us. I turned it over carefully, examining it the way I would examine a load-bearing wall, looking for what it was actually holding up. "You've been looking for me," I said. I asked around. He said it without apology, without the performance of casualness that men usually employed when admitting something that revealed too much. "No one at the site knew your name. You left before I could cross the floor." "I don't enjoy being noticed on sites. People stop letting you work." "I noticed," he said simply, "because the work was extraordinary." The candle between us had burned itself into a low, steady flame by then, throwing soft light across the blueprints he had quietly produced from inside his coat, hand-drawn, detailed, unmistakably old, and spread across the table between the bread and the wine like an offering. "I have another building, and the same problem." I looked at the blueprints, then at him. I reached across and turned the nearest page toward the light. He sent a carriage at 9 in the morning, which told me something about him. Not 10, which would have suggested leisure, nor 8, which would have implied urgency bordering on control. 9 was deliberate. 9 said, "I have considered your time and I respect it." I noticed these things because I had spent a lifetime being read incorrectly by people who never bothered to look closely, and so I had developed, by necessity, the habit of reading everything else with considerable care. The Ravenwood estate sat 12 miles outside the city, at the end of a long approach road flanked by oaks so old they had grown into one another overhead, forming a canopy that filtered the morning light into something fragmented and cathedral-like. I watched it through the carriage window and felt the familiar pull, that particular gravity that old neglected things exerted on me, the way they seemed to lean toward whoever might finally pay attention to them. The house itself appeared at a bend in the road with the abruptness of a confession. It was enormous, and it was suffering. That was the only honest way to describe it. The bones were magnificent, Georgian symmetry, a facade of pale stone that would have glowed like marble in its prime, tall windows and a columned entrance that spoke of an architect who had understood proportion as a form of language. But time and inattention had done their quiet, relentless damage. Ivy consumed the eastern wing entirely. 2 of the upper windows were boarded. The stone balustrade along the roofline had lost sections like missing teeth, and the grounds, once clearly formal, had grown past intention into something that was almost beautiful in its wildness, the way ruins sometimes are. I was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped. Richard was waiting at the entrance, no butler, no assembled household staff performing arrival, just him in simpler clothes than the night before, a coat that had seen actual weather, holding 2 cups of something hot and offering one without preamble. "You've already been outside," I said, accepting the cup. It was coffee, strong and black. "I wanted to see it the way you would, fresh light, no preparation." We began at the eastern wing, which was the most critically compromised, and therefore the most immediately interesting. He walked beside me and said very little, which I appreciated enormously. Most people who commissioned restoration work could not resist narrating, explaining what they wanted, what they envisioned, what they imagined the finished result might resemble. They brought their conclusions with them before the building had been given any opportunity to speak for itself. Richard brought only the keys. He unlocked doors and stood aside. He held back encroaching ivy so I could examine the stonework beneath. When I crouched to press my palm against a section of foundation wall and closed my eyes to feel for what the surface reported, he did not ask what I was doing or how long I would be. He waited with the patience of someone who understood that certain kinds of knowledge could not be hurried. Inside the library, the ancestral library that occupied the entire north wing, floor to ceiling, gallery level intact despite everything, I finally stopped moving. It was the smell that did it first, old vellum and cedar and cool stone, and something underneath all of it, something like memory, dense and layered and irreplaceable. The shelves still held thousands of volumes. Morning light came in weakly through the compromised roof in 2 places, casting pale columns of dusty air down into the silence, and I stood in the middle of it all and felt the particular grief that only beautiful, neglected things can produce. "How long has it been closed?" I asked. "Since my father died, 7 years. I turned to look at him then, really look, the way I had been cautiously avoiding since the previous evening, because direct examination of Richard Davis felt, instinctively, like looking at a load-bearing structure you weren't yet certain could hold scrutiny. What I found was a man standing in the ruins of something that belonged to him, looking not at the damage, but at me, with an expression that had shed every layer of the composed, formidable Duke and arrived at something considerably quieter underneath. "You don't want a trophy for your wall," I said, slowly. The realization moved through me as I spoke it, assembling itself from every detail of the morning, the 9 o'clock carriage, the unlocked doors, the silence, the way he had waited outside the boarded windows to see the light fall correctly. "You never did." "No," he said. "You want this saved. I want it restored," he said with a precision that told me the distinction mattered deeply to him. "There's a difference." There was. I knew it better than anyone. Saving was about preventing further loss. Restoration was about returning something to what it had always been capable of being, not falsifying the damage, not pretending the years hadn't happened, but finding the original intention beneath everything that had accumulated on top of it and making it legible again. I looked back at the library, at the light in the dust, at the shelves of patient, waiting volumes. "I'll need to do a full structural assessment. The roof is the first priority, but I suspect the north foundation has water ingress that isn't visible from the exterior. I'll want to see the original architect's drawings if they exist, and I'll need access every day, not just arranged visits." A pause. Every day. I said, "Buildings talk differently at different hours." Moving toward the nearest shelving unit to examine where it met the wall. "You learn to listen across the whole day, not just when it's convenient." He said nothing for a moment. When I glanced back, he was watching me with that expression again, the one that I was beginning to recognize, the one that was not quite a smile, but carried the weight of one. "Every day," he agreed quietly. Outside, the oaks moved in the morning wind, and the old house settled around us, the way old things do when they sense, finally, that someone has arrived who knows how to listen. The first week, I spoke mostly to the building. This was not unusual for me. Structures have a grammar of their own, a syntax of load and stress and material memory that reveals itself slowly, in increments, to anyone patient enough to learn the language. I moved through the Ravenwood estate with my notebooks and my instruments and my hands, which were, my mother had always complained, perpetually unsuitable for a woman of my standing, calloused in the wrong places, ink-stained at the fingertips, bearing the particular roughness of someone who touched old stone for a living rather than wearing gloves to protect herself from it. Here nobody mentioned my hands. Richard appeared each morning with the same quiet reliability as the 9 o'clock carriage had on that first day. He brought coffee and asked no unnecessary questions, and worked alongside me in a way that took me several days to properly understand, because it was so entirely outside my experience of how men occupied shared spaces. He did not hover, he did not redirect. When I asked him to hold a measuring line, he held it with exactness and said nothing until I had finished. When I needed to think, the silence between us remained uncontested, comfortable as old furniture, and I moved through it freely. By the second week, I had stopped monitoring the space I took up. This was more significant than it sounds. I had spent years compressing myself, keeping my voice low in meetings where men spoke over me regardless, angling my body slightly sideways in rooms where my presence seemed to inconvenience the existing arrangement of things. It was not something I had decided consciously. It was something that had accumulated, the way water damage accumulates invisibly, until one day the wall simply gives. I had learned to occupy as little room as possible and call it composure. But the estate demanded otherwise. You cannot restore a building quietly. You cannot assess a failing roofline from a polite distance or understand a foundation's distress by standing apologetically at its edge. The work required my full presence, my voice, my certainty, my willingness to say, "This wall is wrong," and "That assessment is incorrect," and "No, we are not doing it that way." And gradually, haltingly, I gave it those things. The morning I dismissed the contractor's recommendation outright was the morning something shifted. He had been brought in to assess the North Library roof, a broad, confident man who had arrived with opinions fully formed and a tendency to address his remarks to Richard even when I had asked the question. He recommended a modern overlay installation, fast and inexpensive, and entirely wrong for the original material, and I said so clearly and without qualification, laying out the reasoning in precise, unhurried detail, while he looked at me with the expression men reserve for inconveniences they had not anticipated. When I finished, he turned to Richard. Richard looked at the man with a patience that had ice beneath it. "Miss Owen is leading this respiration," he said, simply. "Her assessment is the final word." The contractor left shortly after. I stood in the library for a long moment after the sound of his carriage had faded down the oak-lined road, holding my notebook, feeling something in my chest that took me an embarrassingly long time to identify. It was not gratitude exactly, or rather it was not only gratitude. It was the strange, disorienting sensation of having been backed by someone without conditions, without the expectation of something owed in return, without the faint edge of condescension that even well-meaning men sometimes could not keep entirely out of their support. "You didn't need to do that," I said, which was becoming, I realized, something of a pattern between us. Richard was examining the roofline through the compromised section, hands in his coat pockets. "I know," he said. "You had already won the argument." A pause. I simply made sure he understood it. I opened my notebook and wrote nothing for a moment, looking at the blank page. "My father has never once done that," I said quietly. I had not planned to say it. It arrived without permission, the way true things sometimes do, slipping out through a gap you hadn't known was open. Richard lowered his gaze from the ceiling to me. He did not rush to fill the space with reassurance or pivot uncomfortably away from the rawness of it. "I know," he said, again softly. The weeks that followed had a rhythm I had never experienced and did not want to examine too closely for fear of disturbing it. Mornings were structural, assessment, measurement, material sourcing, the slow forensic work of understanding what the building had been before understanding what it could become again. Afternoons often found us in the library itself, where I had begun the painstaking work of cataloguing the collection before the roof restoration displaced everything, and where Richard would sometimes read in the chair by the window, present without being intrusive, while I moved along the shelves. It was during one of these afternoons that I caught myself talking at full volume, not the careful, measured register I used in professional settings, not the deliberately diminished tone I employed in my father's house. I was speaking at the natural pitch and pace of someone who had forgotten momentarily to be small, gesturing with my notebook to a section of shelving I had discovered bore concealed decorative details beneath decades of accumulated grime, explaining what I thought the original paintwork might have looked like, what pigments would have been available to the period, how color in a library of this era was never merely decorative, but itself a system of meaning. I stopped mid-sentence. Richard was watching me from his chair with an expression of such uncomplicated attention that I felt suddenly and acutely visible in a way that had nothing to do with exposure. "You don't stop," he said. I looked at him. "You do that," he said, carefully, as though he had been considering how to say it for some time. "You catch yourself speaking, and you pull back, like you're apologizing for taking up sound." The accuracy of it moved me uncomfortably. "Old habit," I said. "I know. I'm asking you to consider breaking it, at least here." "At least here." I turned back to the shelving and pressed my fingertip to the edge of a gilded detail emerging from beneath the grime, and felt the particular satisfaction of finding what had always been there, waiting beneath the accumulated surface of everything that had been allowed to cover it. I began talking again, fully, without pulling back. The building listened, and so did he, and somewhere in the space between the old stone and the morning light and the quiet steadiness of being genuinely heard, I began, incrementally, imperfectly, irrevocably, to remember myself.
My father's summons arrived on a Thursday. Not a letter. Silas Owen did not write letters to his children, because letters implied a distance he preferred not to acknowledge, preferred instead to collapse without warning, so that you were always slightly off balance when he arrived. It was a messenger, liveried and expressionless, who appeared at the Ravenwood gates while I was halfway up a ladder examining the cornice detail on the east wing exterior, and who delivered a sealed card that contained 4 words in my father's handwriting. "Come home, tonight, alone." I read it twice. Then I folded it precisely and put it in my coat pocket and climbed back up the ladder and finished the examination, because whatever Silas Owen wanted from me, it could wait until I had completed what I had started. This small defiance was new. I noted it without ceremony and went back to work. Richard saw my face at the end of the afternoon, when the light had gone amber and the workers had begun to pack away for the day. He said nothing, which was the right response. He walked with me to the carriage and held the door and looked at me in that steady way of his that asked without asking. "My father," I said simply. He nodded once. "I'll be here tomorrow." It was exactly the right thing to say, and I carried it with me the entire drive back into the city, turning it like a smooth stone in a coat pocket, something solid to hold on to. The Owen townhouse smelled the same as it always had, hothouse flowers and furniture polish, and underneath both, something stale and pressurized, the atmosphere of a house where everyone had learned to breathe carefully. The drawing-room was lit with aggressive brightness, every lamp burning, which was my father's way of conducting difficult conversations, flood the room with light so that nothing could hide, including the person across the table from him. Silas was standing at the mantelpiece when I entered. He did not turn immediately, which was also technique. Make them wait in the doorway, make them feel the room belongs to you and they are merely visiting it. I sat down without being invited, and waited. He turned. He looked, I noticed, diminished in some way I couldn't immediately identify, still immaculately dressed, still wearing authority like a second coat, but something around the edges of him had frayed. His eyes carried the particular restlessness of a man tracking multiple calculations simultaneously and finding none of them resolving cleanly. "You've been spending considerable time at Ravenwood," he said. "I've been working," I said. "You've been making yourself unavailable." He moved from the mantelpiece to the chair across from me, settling into it with deliberate ease. "There's a difference." I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence in conversations with my father was one of the few instruments available to me, and I used it carefully. He studied me for a moment with the assessing gaze of a man re-evaluating an asset he had previously underestimated. Then he opened the bureau drawer beside him and placed a document on the table between us. Legal paper, dense with type, bearing the letterhead of a firm I recognized as one that specialized in criminal proceedings. My blood went cold before I had read a single line. "Your brother," Silas said, with the measured calm of someone who had rehearsed this, "has been considerably less discreet than he imagines himself to be. 2 years ago he co-signed financial instruments he had no legal authority to co-sign, on behalf of a company he had no legal standing to represent." A pause, precise and deliberate. "The total liability is substantial. The criminal exposure is considerable." I looked at the document. I looked at my father. "You've known," I said slowly. "You've known, and you've said nothing. I've been managing it," he leaned back, "as I manage everything in this family, quietly and at considerable personal cost." The phrase personal cost landed with the practiced weight of a man who had long since learned to weaponize his own sacrifices. "However, my capacity to continue managing it is currently constrained." There it was, the real room beneath the room. I waited, very still. "The family trust," he said, "has been restructured significantly. There have been investments that did not perform as projected, obligations that required urgent attention. Each euphemism was smooth and uninformative, the financial equivalent of fresh paint over damaged plaster. The short version, Nadine, is that we are in a position that requires a solution." "How much?" I asked. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had not expected the directness. "Enough that your brother's situation cannot be quietly resolved without external support." "How much?" I said again. He told me. The number settled over the room like something physical. I sat with it for a moment, doing the mathematics I already knew the answer to, what I had, what could be liquidated, what the gaps were, how wide and how permanent. Marcus Vane, my father said, into the silence, has expressed a significant personal interest. I looked up. He is prepared to absorb the family's current liability entirely, in addition to settling your brother's legal exposure, in exchange for a formal arrangement. He smoothed the front of his coat. A marriage, Nadine, a proper one, with appropriate settlement terms. He has been admirably patient. Marcus Vane, I knew the name the way you know the names of approaching weather systems, by reputation, by the damage they left in other places, a developer of the predatory variety, a man who bought distressed things, not to restore them, but to strip them, who had built a fortune on the specific skill of identifying vulnerability and pressing on it until it gave. No, I said. The word came out with a steadiness that surprised even me. Silas's expression did not change, which was somehow more alarming than anger. You should consider carefully before. I have considered. No. Then your brother goes to prison. He said it without inflection, without cruelty, which was the most chilling way it could have been said, as simple fact, as cause and effect, as weather. Everything I have built, everything that has given you the comfortable life you've spent the last month apparently abandoning for manual labor, the contempt was faint but precise, dissolves because you decided your preferences mattered more than your responsibilities. I stood up. My hands were steady. I noted this with a detached, distant surprise, the stillness of them, the absence of trembling, the way my body seemed to understand something my mind was still catching up to. "I'll need a week," I said. Silas blinked. It was the first unguarded thing his face had done all evening. "To consider? To make arrangements," I said. I picked up my coat from the chair. I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame and turned back because there was one thing I needed him to understand before I left this room, before I drove back through the lamplit city to think clearly and completely about what came next. "I want you to hear me say this, Father," I said quietly. "Whatever happens from this point forward, whatever I do next, I am not doing it for you. I am doing it for Edmund. Those are different things, and I need you to understand that difference, even if you never have before." I left him standing in his overlit room with the legal documents on the table between the empty chairs, and I stepped out into the night air, which was cold and clean and entirely indifferent to the Owen family's catastrophe. I sat in the stationary carriage for a long moment before telling the driver to move. Then I said very quietly, to no one in particular, "Richard," not a plea, not a question, a direction. I arrived at Ravenwood at 10:30 in the evening without sending word ahead. This was, I recognized, a significant departure from every protocol I had observed in our professional arrangement, and I sat in the carriage for a full minute at the gate debating the wisdom of it, before deciding that the woman who had climbed back up a ladder after receiving her father's summons was not the woman who drove away from difficult things simply because the hour was inconvenient. I knocked. Richard opened the door himself, which meant he had either dismissed the staff for the evening or had heard the carriage on the gravel and come down personally. He was in his shirt-sleeves, a book still in his left hand, and he looked at me standing in his doorway at 10:30 on a Thursday night, with my coat pulled against the cold and whatever was happening in my face, and he said nothing at all. He simply stepped back and held the door open wider. That, more than anything he could have said, undid the last of whatever composure I had been maintaining since leaving my father's townhouse. We sat in the study, where a fire had burned itself down to steady, reliable coals, and I told him everything. Not carefully, not in the edited, diplomatic register I used when navigating rooms full of people who required managing. I told him about the legal documents and Edmund's exposure and the number my father had delivered with such clinical composure, and I told him about Marcus Vane, and I told him what my father expected me to do about all of it. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the fire, the book set aside entirely. "What do you need?" he asked, and here was where I had to be precise, because the answer to that question mattered enormously, not just practically, but in terms of what I was and was not willing to become in the process of surviving my father's particular brand of destruction. "Not money," I said clearly. "I need you to understand that first. I am not here for a rescue." He looked at me steadily. "I know." "My father operates on leverage," I continued, sitting forward. "Every move he makes is built on controlling what other people stand to lose. The debt, Edmund's exposure, Vane's interest, these aren't separate problems. They're a single constructed pressure designed to leave me with no viable direction except the one he's chosen for me." I paused. "So the question isn't how to absorb the damage. The question is how to dismantle the architecture of it entirely." Something shifted in Richard's expression, a sharpening, a recognition, the look of a man who has just understood that the person across from him is several steps ahead of where he expected them to be. "You want to play him," he said. "I want to beat him," I said, "which requires understanding his game well enough to move inside it without being seen until it's too late for him to adjust." Richard rose from his chair and moved to the desk, where he opened a lower drawer and produced a leather document case I had not seen before. He set it on the table between us and met my eyes across it with an expression that was entirely unreadable and completely certain simultaneously. "Silas Owen has been falsifying charitable trust distributions for 11 years, he said quietly. "I have been quietly assembling the evidence for the last 14 months. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the oaks moved in the night wind. "You already knew," I said slowly. "I knew about the corruption," he said. "I didn't know how to surface it without destroying everything collateral, including you." He held my gaze. I was waiting for the right moment. I looked at the document case, then at him. The masquerade, the season's final gala, every board member, every investor, every person whose signature appears in those documents will be in the same room. "Yes," Richard said. "Then that's our moment." He opened the case. I pulled my chair closer. The fire burned low and steady between us, and we began, not as rescuer and rescued, not as duke and dependent, but as two people who had each been quietly building toward the same necessary confrontation, and had finally, sitting in a study at 10:30 on a Thursday night, found each other across the table. My father taught me that power was something you inherited or extracted from others. Sitting here, I was learning it could also be something you built, quietly, deliberately, together, in the spaces other people forgot to watch.
The leak had to look like an accident. This was the part Richard had reservations about, not the exposure itself, not the strategic logic of it, but the specific vulnerability it required of me. Because dismantling my father's perceived financial authority meant offering myself as the instrument of its dismantling, and that meant stepping deliberately into the one arena Silas Owen had always counted on me to avoid, the public one. "If it traces back to you directly," Richard said on the morning we finalized the details, his hands flat on the desk over the documents we had spent 4 evenings organizing into sequence, "he will use it, not the information, the act of it. He'll reframe everything as a daughter's betrayal and make himself the wounded party before anyone has time to examine the actual numbers. I know, which is why it cannot come from me directly." I had thought about this carefully across several sleepless nights, lying in the dark of my own small apartment, the one I rented under a name adjacent to but not identical to Owen, the one my father had always considered an embarrassing eccentricity and I had always considered essential, working the problem the way I worked structural assessments, from the outside in, looking for where the weight was unevenly distributed, where the hidden stress points were, where the whole thing was most likely to give if touched precisely and at the correct angle. The answer arrived at 3 in the morning with the quiet certainty of things that have always been true. Mrs. Hargrove. She was 71 years old, immaculately maintained, socially omnipresent, and the most reliably indiscreet, thoroughly trustworthy woman in the city's entire social apparatus. She did not gossip maliciously, that was the critical distinction. She disseminated information with the sincere conviction that transparency was a civic virtue, and her reach across the drawing rooms, luncheon tables, and correspondence networks of the city's upper tier was, quite simply, unrivaled. More importantly, she had been a close friend of my mother's before my mother had been quietly diminished out of all her friendships by the sustained gravitational force of being married to Silas Owen. I called on her on a Tuesday afternoon with a tin of the specific shortbread she was known to prefer, and I told her with carefully constructed casualness, over tea, in the manner of a daughter quietly and reluctantly concerned about her family's situation, that I had become worried about my father's financial decisions, that certain investments seemed irregular, that the charitable trust distributions had not, to my understanding, been properly audited in some years, that I was not certain who one would even speak to about such concerns, that I hoped I was simply being anxious and that everything was perfectly in order. I left 40 minutes later, having said nothing that was not true. By Thursday, the drawing rooms were murmuring. By Friday, 2 financial journalists had made inquiries at the Owen family offices. By Saturday morning, my father called. I let the telephone ring 4 times before answering, which was a small thing, and also, in the precise accounting of this particular war, not small at all. "What have you done?" It was not a question. His voice had shed every layer of the drawing-room composure, the velvet and the careful modulation, and what remained underneath was something harder and less rehearsed. I had never heard it before. In another life, it might have frightened me. "I've had tea with an old friend of mother's," I said. "Nadine." "You taught me that information is currency, father." I kept my voice even, neither warm nor cold, simply factual. "I've simply made a small withdrawal." The silence on the line was a different quality from any silence I had heard from him before. Not the strategic pause of a man timing his response for effect, something genuinely unsteady, a man finding the floor less solid than he had believed it to be. "You have no idea what you've set in motion," he said, and beneath the threat there was something that almost resembled desperation. "Actually," I said quietly, "I have a very precise idea." I replaced the receiver. My hand, I noticed, was completely steady. The murmuring became visible movement within days. 2 board members made discreet inquiries about the trust's audit history. A journalist published a carefully worded piece, nothing actionable, nothing definitive, but pointed enough to make Vane's association with the Owen family suddenly less attractive to his own investors, who had their own reputations to consider and preferred their arrangements uncontroversial. Marcus Vane withdrew his interest on a Wednesday. Not formally, not in writing. He simply stopped appearing and stopped communicating, which was the manner in which men like Vane registered retreat, by treating the entire episode as something that had never quite solidified into reality, something that could be left behind without acknowledgement. Edmund called me the same evening, his voice carrying that particular mixture of confusion and relief that told me he didn't yet fully understand what had happened or why the pressure he had been living under for 2 years had, without explanation, begun to ease. "Nadine," he said, "what's going on?" "Nothing yet," I said, "but soon." I was standing at the window of my apartment, looking out at the lamplit street below, where the city moved in its ordinary, continuous way, indifferent as always to the private battles being conducted above it in drawing rooms and studies, and the careful, deliberate conversations of people who had finally decided they had been quiet long enough. On my desk, Richard's document case sat closed and waiting. The masquerade was 11 days. My father's power was a performance, an elaborate, sustained production dependent on the audience believing the set was structural, that the painted walls were load-bearing, that the whole magnificent facade was holding something real up rather than simply concealing the emptiness behind it. The audience, I knew now, was almost ready to see the building for what it actually was. We simply had to choose the right moment to remove the false wall.
I wore gold, not the safe, apologetic ivory that my family considered appropriate for women who needed to be present without being noticed, not the presentable emerald of the auction night, which had been my mother's suggestion and had done nothing to protect me from the spotlight regardless. Gold, deep and unapologetic, a gown that caught light the way restored gilding catches it, not generating its own shine, but returning what was given to it, fully and without reservation. Richard saw me at the top of the entrance stairs and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You look like someone who has already won." "We haven't yet," I said. "No," he agreed, offering his arm, "but you look like it regardless." The Oldemere masquerade occupied the grandest ballroom in the city, and the city had dressed itself accordingly. Masks of every architectural complexity moved through the candlelight, feathered, jeweled, gilded, lacquered, turning the assembled gathering into something simultaneously more and less human than usual, faces half erased, identities pleasantly blurred. It was, I thought, the perfect environment for what we intended to do, a room already comfortable with the idea that surfaces did not tell the complete story. We had arrived early. This was deliberate. Richard needed to have spoken with 3 specific people before my father arrived, and I needed to have confirmed the presence of the 2 journalists Richard's solicitor had quietly invited under the guise of covering the season's social finale for their respective publications. Both were present. I confirmed this within the first 20 minutes, identifying them by the particular attentiveness of people who are working in a room full of people who are performing leisure. I caught the eye of the one nearest the eastern wall and gave the smallest, most imperceptible nod. She returned it. My father arrived at 9 o'clock precisely, which was Silas Owen's way of announcing importance, not fashionably late, which suggested insecurity, not punctual, which suggested eagerness, but 9 o'clock, which said, "The evening begins when I enter it." He had brought Marcus Vane, which surprised me for a moment before it didn't. Vane's public withdrawal had been exactly that, public, performed for the benefit of his own investors. Privately, I understood now, the arrangement between the 2 men ran considerably deeper than a proposed marriage. It was structural. They needed each other in ways that neither could afford to have examined. This was, in fact, the precise vulnerability we intended to press. Richard excused himself from my side at 9:30 with a look that said everything necessary and nothing extraneous. I watched him move through the masked crowd toward the corner where the board members had gathered, 3 men whose names appeared on the trust documents and who, in the past 10 days of mounting public scrutiny, had become considerably more interested in being seen on the correct side of whatever was coming. I turned and found my father. He was watching me from across the room with an expression I had never received from him before, something between calculation and a wariness he could not entirely suppress. The gold gown, perhaps, or the fact that I was standing in the center of the room rather than its periphery, or simply that I was meeting his gaze directly and steadily and showing no inclination to look away first. He crossed to me. Vane followed at a slight distance, which told me everything about the actual geometry of their relationship. Vane, the shadow, my father, the surface. Nadine, he leaned in to kiss my cheek, the performance of paternal warmth flawless and completely empty. You look remarkable. I feel it, I said. Something flickered behind his eyes. He had expected deference, or at minimum the careful neutrality I had always maintained in public. The straightforward confidence was a variable he was recalculating in real time. I think it's time we resolved our family situation, he said quietly, with a smile that was intended for anyone watching, privately and sensibly. I agree completely about the resolving part. Vane stepped forward then, smooth and constructed, a man whose entire surface was a negotiating position. Miss Owen, you look extraordinary this evening. I hope we might find a moment to— Mr. Vane. I turned to him with the same composure I used when addressing contractors who had arrived with wrong assumptions. I've been meaning to ask you something. The Charworth Development acquisition, specifically the charitable trust instruments you co-signed with my father in 2019, were those filed with the original board authorization or the amended version dated 6 weeks later? The question landed in the small space between us like a structural assessment, precise, technical, and immediately revealing in what it produced. Vane's constructed surface did not shatter, men like Vane did not shatter, but something behind his eyes performed a rapid, visible recalibration, and the smile that followed was 3/4 of a second slower than it should have been. I'm not sure this is the venue for— Perhaps not, I agreed pleasantly, though I understand the documents themselves are somewhat less discreet about the venue question, don't you think? My father's hand found my elbow, firm, the grip of a man reasserting control of a situation he sensed slipping. Nadine! And then the room shifted. It was not dramatic, no sudden hush, no theatrical moment of revelation. It was quieter and more permanent than that. Richard had reached the center of the ballroom, accompanied by his solicitor and by the 2 board members who, in the past fortnight, had quietly transferred their professional loyalties to wherever solid ground appeared to be. The solicitor presented copies to the 2 journalists simultaneously. The board members stepped forward and formally requested, in voices pitched just loudly enough to carry beyond our immediate circle, an emergency review of the charitable trust on the grounds of financial misconduct. My father's grip on my elbow went very still. I looked at him, really looked, the way I looked at damaged buildings, without flinching and without sentiment, seeing the actual condition beneath the maintained surface. What I found was a man watching the architecture of 30 years disassemble itself in a single ballroom on a Friday evening, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the foundation was never as solid as he had required everyone around him to believe. I gently removed his hand from my elbow. You built everything on the assumption that we would all stay small. That was the miscalculation. Vane had already moved, I noted this peripherally, edging toward the far exit with the practiced, unhurried speed of a man who had spent his career identifying the precise moment to detach from sinking structures. 2 of Richard's associates intercepted him at the door in a manner that was entirely civil and entirely immovable. Richard returned to my side. The room continued around us, the music, the masks, the candlelight performing its indifferent beauty across 100 oblivious faces, and in the center of it my father stood with the documents in the hands of people he could no longer manage, and the evening continued as evenings do, regardless. "All right," Richard said quietly beside me. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The room was warm. The music was adequate. My father was, for the first time in my living memory, entirely without recourse.
Somewhere across the city, Edmund was having a quiet dinner, unaware that the weight he had been carrying for 2 years had, in the last 10 minutes, been definitively lifted. "Yes," I said, and I found, examining the answer carefully, that it was entirely and completely.
My father left the city on a Tuesday. No announcement, no farewell, no final performance of dignity before an assembled audience, which was perhaps the truest indication of how completely the previous Friday had undone him. Silas Owen had always required witnesses. He had constructed his entire existence around the presence of people watching, had drawn his authority from the act of being observed exercising it. To leave without an audience was, for a man like my father, not merely defeat, it was erasure. His solicitor contacted Edmund with the formal details 2 weeks later. The board had accepted Silas's resignation with the quiet efficiency of people relieved to be managing a conclusion rather than a continuing crisis. The trust was placed under independent administration pending the full audit. Vane's separate legal exposure was, by all accounts, considerably more complicated and would occupy the courts for some time, which was not my concern and which I noted with detachment rather than satisfaction, because satisfaction would have required more investment in his fate than I intended to give. Edmund came to Ravenwood on the first dry morning of the following week. He stood in the entrance hall looking at the restored stonework and the cleaned windows and the quality of light that moved through the north wing differently now that the roof had been properly addressed, and he was quiet for a long time before he turned to me with the expression of a man assembling an apology that was several years overdue and uncertain of its adequacy. "Nadine, I know," I said gently. "I should have—" "Edmund," I put my hand briefly on his arm, "I know." He looked at the ceiling, at the restored plasterwork, the original cornicing cleaned back to its actual detail, the paint colors sourced from period records and applied by hands that understood the difference between reproduction and restoration. He was quiet again for a moment, and when he looked back at me, his eyes were over-bright in a way I chose not to remark on. "It's extraordinary," he said, "what you've done here." "What we've done," I said, because that was accurate, and accuracy mattered. Richard proposed in the library. This surprised me somewhat, not because the location was wrong, it was in fact exactly right, but because he did it in the middle of a working morning, while I was on the library ladder examining the upper gallery shelving for the residual moisture damage we had been tracking for 6 weeks, and he simply appeared at the base of the ladder and waited until I looked down. He was holding nothing, no ring presented on a velvet surface, no orchestrated setting, no performance of the gesture designed for the telling of it afterward, just Richard, in his working clothes, looking up at me with that expression I had spent months learning to read and had never entirely learned finished, and said, "I would like to do this, all of this, for the rest of my life, with you specifically, not someone suitable, not someone appropriate, you." I looked at him from the top of the ladder for a moment. "I'm going to finish this section first," I said. A pause. "Of course." I completed the examination. I made my notes. I descended the ladder with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who had learned the value of finishing what she started, and when I reached the bottom and turned to face him, we were standing close enough that the question needed no repetition, and the answer needed no volume at all. "Yes," I said. "Obviously, yes." We married in the library on the 14th of March, when the restoration was complete enough to hold us properly, and incomplete enough to remind us that some things are always, in the best possible sense, still in progress. I had not wanted a large wedding. Richard had not wanted one either, which was one of the 1,000 small compatibilities we had accumulated without cataloguing, like sediment that becomes over time the thing the building rests on. Edmund was there, and Richard's cousin from Edinburgh, who had his eyes and his silences, and Mrs. Hargrove, who wept with the sincere and generous emotion of a woman for whom other people's happiness was a genuine and primary pleasure. The library smelled the same as it had on the first morning, old vellum and cedar and cool stone, but it was warmer now and lighter, and the details that had spent decades beneath grime and neglect were visible again in their original clarity. The cornicing, the gilded shelving brackets, the restored gallery rail, each baluster examined and repaired individually, the damaged ones replaced in matching period timber rather than substituted for something easier. I had insisted on this last detail. Richard had not needed convincing. We stood on the original floor, stone, cleaned and repointed, bearing its age honestly, without apology, and the registrar read the words that made the arrangement official, and I listened to Richard's voice beside me, saying the things that people say in these moments, and finding for the first time in my experience of such language that the words felt exactly proportionate to what they were attempting to describe, which was not a small thing. Afterward, while Edmund talked to Richard's cousin and Mrs. Hargrove examined the restored shelving with the proprietary appreciation of someone who felt personally involved in the outcome, Richard and I stood together at the north window, the one that was boarded when I first arrived, the one that now looked out over the grounds where the formal garden was slowly, seasonally returning to its original design, and held our glasses of champagne and said very little. Outside, the March light was thin and clear and honest. The oaks along the drive were just beginning to suggest the green that was coming. The grounds bore the particular quality of early spring in old places, everything stripped back to its essential structure, every line visible, the whole landscape legible in a way that the fullness of summer would eventually beautifully obscure. "What are you thinking?" Richard asked. I considered this properly, because he always asked questions properly, and they deserved proper answers. "I'm thinking about the East Garden, the original planting design. I found a reference to it in the 3rd volume of the Household Records, the one with the water damage on the spine. There was a specific arrangement of the borders that the current layout doesn't reflect. It would take 2 seasons to restore correctly." He turned to me with the expression I had come to understand was his version of happiness, not performed, not announced, simply present in the specific quality of his attention. 2 seasons, he said. "At minimum," I said. "Some things can't be rushed." "No," he agreed, "they can't." The library held us quietly behind, and the grounds stretched open ahead, and the foundation beneath our feet was stone and mortar and original timber, and 11 months of 2 people choosing daily and without fanfare to build something that would last. I had arrived at Ravenwood looking for what the building needed. I had not expected to find in the same investigation what I needed myself, not rescue, not visibility, not the validation of a room full of witnesses finally paying attention, simply this, a foundation honest enough to build on, and someone beside me who understood that the work of restoration, the real work, is never entirely finished. That it continues, season by season, in the hands of people who know the difference between what something appears to be and what it has always, underneath everything, been capable of becoming. I set my champagne glass on the windowsill and turned back to the room. There was still so much work to do. I found, looking around at all of it, the shelves and the light and the people and the patient, beautiful, unfinished building holding all of us, that this was not a problem. It was, in every way that mattered, the point.